lizards, no aliens, no nonsense. This is Reality Bytes in association with Sovereign Independent UK and One World Chronicle.
Reality Bytes on the 24th of November 2014, and if there's anybody here who tried to go onto realitybytes.com, unfortunately that site was taken down somehow 4 minutes before we went there, and when it's been running fine for over a week with no problems whatsoever. There you go. We'll have two guests tonight, as many of you will already know. I've got Thomas Sheridan, who I've spoken to many times before, and Alan Watt, similarly spoke to many times before on a variety of subjects, as with Thomas. I thought it'd be a good idea to get both of them on tonight to basically have a chat amongst themselves. I'm just going to sit back in the wilderness, as it were, and take a few notes, and if I think of anything to ask, then I'll come back and ask. But Thomas, you there?
Yes, I am indeed.
Yep. Alan, you hearing okay?
Yes, I can, yep.
Okay, Thomas put a couple of subjects forward. One was the Fabians, and the other one was the whole distraction, if you like, or for want of a better word, the alien agenda type of thing. We're going to start on the Fabians. So, Thomas, if you want to start off, and I'll leave you to it.
Well, my interest in the Fabians was rekindled while I was researching for my last book on the history of the occult in Germany in terms of how the occult is being used in social control. And H.G. Wells in particular, how the Fabians were not just a political organization, they were very much a social engineering and cultural operation as well. And I was very struck by how, in particular, H.G. Wells was using science fiction to almost future-proof the world going forward. You had the likes of Things to Come, which is basically showing the world of today in terms of when it gets to the point where you have this group called Wings Over the World, which is referred to as a Freemasonry of the air, and they drop this thing called the gas of peace on rogue nations who do not agree with the Wings Over the World format of how global society should be concentrated towards this kind of scientific global lab rat kind of mindset where human beings are essentially just cogs in an enormous kind of socialist machine towards a scientific end, purely a scientific materialistic end. And I never really realized how deep this ran until I read an autobiography of H.G. Wells, who was a particularly appalling human being in many ways. He was a ferocious bigot. He basically couldn't stand anyone who wasn't at least lower upper class, public school educated and Presbyterian. There was no place for anyone in the world that did not conform to his sort of respectable notions of society. And while I was researching for the book, I came across a quote by H.G. Wells where someone had accused him of being basically a national socialist in terms of his philosophy, in terms of his ideas. And H.G. Wells replied by saying that he was a combination of basically Hitler and Stalin, and if he was a dictator, he would be very, very cruel. And we were brought into ideas of how he wanted to, incredible ideas, like he wanted people to all wear standard uniforms. People would not be allowed to own boats because if they did, they would try to escape to islands off the coast where they would try and live outside this socialist utopia that the Fabians had envisioned. But more than anything else, it was the idea of culture, of building these kind of pathological mythologies in the heads of human beings, which were to future-proof the Fabian ideas going forward. And this was not a new thing, actually, with H.G. Wells. It had happened before him in Germany. But in terms of the Fabians, they've shown up with the emergence of this Russell Brand character who's come out very closely connected to the New Statesman magazine. Again, part of this same cultural creation, the idea that people, in terms of popular culture, not just science fiction, not just pop music, not just TV, everything really, even down to sport, are fundamentally aligned with the Fabian trajectory of social engineering, because we're basically living in a gigantic laboratory. We're the rats and the Fabians are the researchers tinkering with our consciousness.
Yeah, there's that. There's no doubt about it. There was definitely a much, much bigger plan. Even today, they're very quiet about all the other forces involved in this organization. You find that, for instance, the Milner Group, the Alfred Milner Group that eventually formed, along with the Cecil Rhodes Society, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, that literally drafted up the European draft for amalgamation, and for the Americas too, with the CFR, which is their branch as well. They were involved heavily in the Fabian Society, and many of their members were crossovers between the two, in fact. They had to get the working class on their side by telling them that they would be their champions. It was they would use a form of Marxism initially, and for rights, etc., better conditions. No one complained about that back then. It was awful. And they fooled the working class. They needed an army behind them to bring all of this in. But when you look at the big players who were involved, where they really wanted to take the people eventually, it was very close to communism. And even in the early days of Lenin, right through to in fact, to later dictators in the Soviet Union, they boasted in the Fabian Society they had a direct line to Moscow, and that is a fact. They did definitely have a direct line. There was a working. Their idea was to bring this form of elite management of a whole society and eventually a world, a scientific elite management, starting with Britain and then the empire. They would use the empire and eventually eradicate a lot of the initial domestic races that existed, thereby massive immigration and so on. They came up with the idea of free trade too, and free movement of labour across borders, way back in the 1800s. And then when you look at who backed the Fabian Society financially, a lot of the money came from Lord Astor, and he was an American businessman. And he and his wife moved to Britain, and they became Viscount and then Lord. And they had, back then, their money was estimated in today's term in the multi-billions of pounds, actually. So big money was backing this group, and they need the working class army to think that it was actually their movement. And in reality, it was a specialist scientific elite at the top that was going to run the general population from birth to death, and train them from birth to death to serve the system, basically happily serve the system. So that's quite true. There's much more involved in the Fabians than meets the eye until you really go into the deep memberships that crossed over into the Royal Institute for International Affairs. Yeah.
Well, of course, the Astor family are still involved in the system today, with David Cameron.
Oh, so are the Benns, by the way. You know, in Britain, you have the Wedgwood family that were they were the champions too of Darwin. In fact, they were intermarried completely with Darwin. His mum was Wedgwood, and they became the Wedgwood-Benns. And you had Anthony Wedgwood-Benn. Now you've got a daughter, I think, and maybe a son in as well, who've reclaimed their title, because they also have titles. Tony Benn put it to the side for a while because he had to get the Labour Party behind him. But now the son's reclaimed the title, the hereditary titles. These are big, important, wealthy families running the Labour Party today. And, of course, the Fabian Society is still alive and well behind the scenes as a big think tank that works with the global establishment, United Nations, and so on, to bring in the scientifically controlled society. Yeah.
If you even look at the family tree of the Wedgwoods, the Huxleys and the Darwins, it really is basically the farm of today's, bureaucratic administrative elite, the ones the next level down from royalty. And if you look at Julian Huxley, who was in UNESCO, he wrote copiously, in fact, about and really detailed about their big world agenda. And he did say there are different groups. That there's a financial elite, he said, at the top, the dominant minority. And then you have another dominant minority that are employed by the financial elites, and that is the scientific elite. And he said, I and my family are part of the scientific elite. They also include the social sciences and psychology and so on. So it's all combined, and that's how we're managed today, basically. And below that you have entertainment and education and everything else that augments it all, yeah. They were also turning culture on its head. Using culture to turn history on its head. in Huxley's book of the Devils of Loudun, about the basically a witch burning trial that happened in France during the Reformation. He totally turned around the central character in this episode. When you read the actual real history, this guy, this priest at Loudun was absolutely psychopathic. He had scant disregard for women. He was causing tremendous problems between the Catholics and Protestants, the Huguenots at the time, in the town, which was basically a powder keg. He knew he had protection of the French monarchy. Now, when Aldous Huxley wrote this book on him, he completely twisted it around to portray this sort of womanizing psychopathic priest as a kind of a Jim Morrison, free spirit, free love, liberal ahead of his time, who was burned for being, basically a 60s hippie type character living during the Reformation. And in reality, it was nothing like that. He also portrayed the nuns at the convent, the sisters who were involved in accusing him of witchcraft, as being hysterical females, but completely kind of left out the fact that they had basically been mind controlled and destroyed. So what we're having also with these Fabians and these also not just the Fabians, but also that generally connected circle, is this idea of also taking history and rewriting it. Again, future-proofing historical characters.
That's still going on. It's going on all the time. Yeah, constantly. History's always being rewritten. Some of it, actually, most history today is actually pre-written, like 9/11. The whole agenda, down to screaming out it was Ben Laden on the first day it happened, before the dust settled, it was all pre-written, and every authorized historian knows that they have to go by the official story that was all laid out at the very beginning. And that's how precise it is today, and no one can contradict it, or you're a conspiracy nut or something like that. So that's how things really are. And again, the Fabian connection with the Cecil Rhodes group. And Cecil Rhodes, remember, wanted a world society run along the British lines, the elite British lines, and they would use the empire to do it, and join one up again through trade pacts and treaties with the United States. And they would form this world empire type of deal and bring commerce across the world, but it would always be held in the hands of the few and big corporations at the top. They've achieved every goal pretty well that they laid out back in the 1800s. Yeah.
And if you look at the Labour Party, its connection through the London School of Economics, which was founded essentially by the Fabians through George Bernard Shaw, you can barely find a senior Labour cabinet minister while they're in government, either a chancellor or the prime minister himself, who does not have a direct connection in some way to the London School of Economics.
Yeah, and Sidney Webb again was fundamental in setting that up. I mean, the Webb family, the Sidney and Beatrice, and they were part of the Potter family too, like Beatrice Potter. They laid out the foundations for what they call women's lib. They would use elite families, their daughters, to promote it initially, so that the rest would follow down below, or the lower classes. But the intention really, again, was to create armies of people who'd obey this, what they would call the new governmental system. The whole thing was militarized. It was all armies, and the separation of the genders and so on. And that, again, is where, later authors got their ideas. Like in 1984, you'd have the women who were the dedicated virgins sort of thing, serving the system. This was all laid out back in the 1800s for those who don't understand that. And these guys, I mean, at the very top, you have the war-making machine working again, and owned and run and operated by the financial elite of Britain in those days. And that was an incredible amount of money that they had in those days, because they owned a world empire. They could loot countries' resources like crazy, and they were doing it. And so you had the Cecil Rhodes Foundation Society, along with Lord Rothschild, because the two of them created it together. And they were to take over the world's resources, gold, silver, eventually went into oil later on, things like that. But they also had the war-making machinery involved in them too. They had an arm and a branch for every facet of this future society that they hope to bring in. And you can go back into Cecil Rhodes' education. He was educated by Dean Rusk at Oxford University. And Dean Rusk came up with the idea of the British Empire rule, which definitely would merge back with the US down the road, again, be part of this whole world empire system. They'd bring in other countries, and the latter countries, the countries they would bring in would be China and the Far East and so on. Well, that's exactly where it's all been going all along. So the American branch had to be called the Council on Foreign Relations because Royal wouldn't suit them very well, Royal Institute of International Affairs. And for the Labour people, there would be the big army of workers along a Marxist type system, and also the soldiers from the same groupings. They would be trained by the Fabian type indoctrinations that they had. They also were into the eradication of all the old religions, but they also brought in the New Age religion back then from Hinduism actually. Annie Besant, one of the members of the Fabian Society, founding members, she was one of the Theosophists. She was a Blavatsky. She took over from Blavatsky, Madame Blavatsky, and she really was to bring in this new thought, because really Hinduism, when you bring it to the West, is a definite form of mind control. Where nothing is real unless you have a master or a guru who tells you what is real. Even if the thing they're telling you is real, is not real at all, you will believe them. It's a new thought, a new way of conditioning people into a belief system which has nothing to do with any actual reality. So that's all mixed up together. They didn't miss anything, in fact. And Besant Annie Besant said herself she would literally end marriage amongst men and women. Everyone would eventually serve the state, and the state would finance women to have children.
And culturally, a lot of this was catalysed within the 1960s and the whole swinging London, Carnaby Street,
It started before, actually. They tried it in the 1920s. With the jazz and with the speakeasies or booze cans, and that's why the same groupings used the religious movements to bring in prohibition, as in the States, for instance. And that before that, very very few young people actually went out to get drunk, and so it made it a very a sinful thing to go to. So it was great, anything that was bad you go and do. And they brought in the jazz, they brought in coke at the same time in the 1920s, for those who don't know that. And they got high and so on. But the problem was they didn't have the pill, any kind of contraception. And same happened in Britain with it too. And so suddenly you had all these orphanages springing up to take care of the children that were unwanted. And it's kind of fell apart from there. They brought in the miniskirt then too, with the Charleston dance, etc. So they went back to the drawing board, and right up to the 1960s, they took the tax money off the public to create some kind of contraception. And when the 60s came out, they had the pill ready, and they just simply regurgitated the same agenda again, and it took off from there. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The backstreet abortion flourished during that early 20s period, because they didn't have the pill, as you said. And also people like Frank Sinatra's mother she was an abortionist who worked in around the jazz scene in Hoboken, New Jersey. And that was a way that was actually, there was so much demand, there was so much pregnancy at that time because of this sort of proto 60s mindset that that was the only industry that literally flourished in poor and immigrant neighborhoods.
In fact, Armand Hammer's father was an abortionist too. Armand Hammer. His father was an abortionist and a quack chemist who was, put in prison a few times for doing abortions and so on and killing folk with his quack cures. And Armand Hammer, again, a big member of the Marxist organizations. In fact, he had an apartment set up next to Lenin and then Stalin eventually. Armand Hammer, the son, he promoted all of these same agendas throughout the West to destroy the old system, to bring in this new system of total scientific control. Remember, that's really what the Soviet system was about too. It was scientific control of the masses, as I say. In fact, Annie Besant also coined the term, along with Beatrice Webb. They called it the collective. So you're called the collective. Everybody who's not one of the elite is a collective. Yeah.
One of those.
Thing.
Sorry, Thomas.
Sorry,
just a quick word. You mentioned the sexual revolution back in the 20s, Alan. I think there's a documentary. Is it Sin Cities?
Yes, right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's Shanghai, London, and Berlin. Was it? There were.
That's right. The Sin City. They had Paris. Yeah, and it's an excellent documentary. It's called Sin Cities, and it's amazing because I think Canada were the ones who promoted it all. And everybody who comes on, these social critics that come on, absolutely glorify and drool, because it's politically correct to glorify this kind of stuff, of the degradation of the whole people of these cities, where they created massive financial depressions. Women were flooding in there, dirt poor. They were put on stage in Berlin, for instance, stark naked. And at the end of the night, these massive halls, these rich folk would all have sex with them, like massive, massive orgies. They even had women who were in all stages of pregnancy, so that guys could have sex with them in the different stages of pregnancy, depending on what fetish you were into. It was absolutely disgusting, and they flooded those cities with drugs too. Absolute hell, and yet they call this a great liberalization of society. Absolutely disgusting. And then they had it in Shanghai as well. And you'll find the big, even the cosmetic heads of the day built great, massive casinos and brothels all over Shanghai at the time too. And the white Russians that were driven out of the Soviet Union ended up prostituting themselves there because they were dirt poor as well. It's just disgusting how it's glorified the total degradation of humanity. And it was all to get people used to the idea that human beings were nothing really, that we were another animal. Excess population or unwanted children could just be killed on the spot even after birth. And of course, they went back to the drawing board after that when it didn't catch on too quickly in America and the States, and gave us lots of indoctrination until folk think nothing about it today. It's just, I've actually heard women talking about it, and they'll say it's like getting a wart removed. That's how life is valued today. Yeah.
Yeah, you have the likes of Gloria Steinem with her, I had an abortion T-shirt. And then she campaigns against, having animals shot, but it's no problem, killing humans.
Yeah, that's right. And Steinem too. It came out, and it's all public, open record. This is not conspiracy stuff. I never talk about this conspiracy stuff. I talk about documented stuff from the sources that do it all. And Steinem did work for the CIA. They set up her magazine. And financed it all along. And you understand, your CIA and your MI6 and MI5 and so on are not working for you. They're all part of this one big system again, including the Fabian Society and all the other think tanks they have working on managing a massive world population. And believe you me, they have no favorites in a country that they're based in. You're all the same peasantry as the peasants of China to them.
Well, she began by spying on her fellow students. Liberal students. She was spying on them because they were liberals. What she was basically, I'm being paid by the CIA to do it. That's the quality of character she has. And then she turns tables completely. Yeah, and then she becomes one of these so-called liberals herself, going from the ultra-conservative, like old-fashioned blue blood style, to the new liberal. Like a typical psychopathic switch, it means nothing. It's just like taking a CD out of one machine and putting it in the other. Absolutely no principles or any kind of conviction. Just tell me what I believe this week and who I'm working for.
That's right, and that's the same thing too with some recent prime ministers of Britain. They were spied on their fellow students and even ran for the Labour Party and won. So it's the same old thing over and over again, yeah.
How they can switch parties, crossing the floor. Voting
Winston
against
Churchill did that all the time.
He did that all the time. Yeah, he was actually that was based. He was the definition of a political animal in that sense. In that it's his own political survival, even to the deaths of hundreds of millions of people if it took it. From the Dardanelles when he sacrificed 5,000 British seamen to get new warships, to the Ottoman mines and guns, all the way to goading the United States to nuke Russia in the 1950s, purely his own political survival that had been, inbred into him since his childhood in Blenheim Palace. It never left him. He was a pure political psychopathic machine.
Oh, yeah, right down to handing over Poland and a few other countries after World War II, signed in the Yalta Agreement during the war with Stalin, that the Russians would get those countries. I mean, it just roll off whole country. Listen, yeah, you have these people, these millions of, you just take them, do with them as you wish.
And the concentration camps in South Africa, while he was pontificating in the 50s about the horrors of the Nazis and then later the gulags in the Soviet Union, here was the guy who basically invented the idea of mass concentration camps of women and children in order not only to attack these communities, but also to basically, dishearten the enemy troops, who knew that their wives and kids were starving in a labor camp. This was invented by Churchill.
That's right. There's the Boer War, sure. Remember, too, though, he also belonged to this one organization that eventually was called the Royal Institute for International Affairs and Alfred Milner Group. But even Churchill, this is how elite this club is, this organization. Even Churchill, during World War II, wasn't completely in the loop, because there's an inner circle and an outer circle, and that's where you find that 1984 has it in it too, the inner party, the outer party, and Winston Churchill was outside the loop. And when he found out, he blew up and talked about it in Parliament in a speech. He said it's amazing. He says that a group of very, very rich and old families have been manipulating us through about 4 or 5 different wars, he says. And he was only angry because he wasn't completely in on the whole picture at the time. After that, they had to bring him in completely. So the front men are often used, they're little egotists, and they certainly benefit financially themselves with all their deals, like Tony Blair. But they're not necessarily in the upper inner party. The inner party that Milner set up was very secretive. In fact, he said in his own writings, and this is what Carl Quigley talked about it, because he was their historian for a long time later on. But he said that they based it on the Jesuit technique, which is awfully interesting technique of going into places, pretending you're one of the people, getting gradually to know them, never argue with them, no matter about their political views, and then gradually subvert from within. So they've done this across the world. They've fomented revolutions in countries. They're still at it today. It's one of the biggest, or if it is the biggest organization for power in the world, is the Royal Institute for International Affairs today in the Council on Foreign Relations. Every top newspaper man in Britain, every editor in the States as well, must be a member of it to succeed, or you will not. You can simply close ranks, and believe you me, even your paper supply will get cut off if they don't want you up there. Incredible power, and Reuters is part of them too, owned by the Rothschilds. So they control the news of the world, the entire planet. This is how it really is. Yeah.
This infatuation they have with the Jesuits has always been very interesting to me, especially, as these people claim to be atheists and, totally against religion, and yet they have people like Peter Sutherland, who's basically the head of everything, the former Goldman Sachs chairman, head of the World Bank. This guy was educated in a very exclusive Dublin Jesuit college where they teach the students how to manipulate and control situations through complex games of chess. Mm-hmm. The Jesuit power structure is enormous in this world, and yet we hear about everything else, or there's an assumption that somehow the Jesuits are purely associated with religion, theology, administrative things within the Vatican, or they're a historical entity. But even if they're not overtly religious, it's when you start looking at how many of these people who are actually in many of the top power structures, a lot of them have Jesuit schooling.
Oh, even Stalin had Jesuit schooling. Yeah. So I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, their educational system is far superior than anyone else's, because they certainly have it down to incredible, good art and how to indoctrinate children, but also give them an education which they teach reason, for instance, which isn't taught in public schools anymore, or general schools, comprehensive schools, and logic. and they also teach them oratory as well. Oratory is awfully important, again, in order to avoid arguments and debates, but also win your debate by using logic and reason and very skillful oratory. It's all to do with logic. That isn't taught outside of them. You find that the speakers, even Tony Blair, again, a guy who was paid to inform on Radical Labour Party members when he was young, you find that he was taking that too. And he had all the earmarks of oratory when he went up to make world speeches on wars that he wanted to get Britain into. It was a one-man band, basically, very skillful, etc., in that one department. But he was also psychopathic. That's why he was also so good at it. So these guys are all over the place. They're in all the top CEOs of corporations have all the same attributes of skillful oratory, but also their psychopathic personalities. They're actually selected for that purpose.
Oh, I have no doubt about that. And that was probably rooted in the Jesuit thing. If you look at the BBC itself, basically a Fabian subdivision or offshoot in many ways. They had a long-running TV series from the 60s called Seven and Up, where the idea was to follow the Jesuit idea, give me a child of 7 and I'll give you the man. And here was the BBC have followed these same people every 7 years to produce this documentary. And the idea is it's put out there as they're showing the life of Britain through these people every 7 years. And they're up into their 50s now. And it's nothing of the sort. It's really a gigantic big laboratory that the BBC are running according to Jesuitic principles of monitoring people, seeing that. And even if you watch the programs themselves, there's all kinds of subtle editorials. Like there was one guy at one point who had basically dropped out of the system in the early 80s, and he'd basically become kind of like a hermit, artistic type person. He'd basically woken up and he was living in Scotland in a caravan, and the whole thing was portrayed as what a loser he was, what a failure he was. He had all these opportunities in life, and all he wants to do now is live in a caravan in Scotland and talk about philosophy and poetry. And every shot was composed to make him look like a sad sack and a loser, coming back from the shops with his little plastic bag of groceries. And then in the follow-up series 7 years later, it shows, and the most remarkable turnaround of all was this character, and they show him that he's now a Lib Dem politician. He's going from door to door, and so suddenly he's not a loser anymore. The BBC are portraying him as, the ideal man who's, he went off the rails for a while and was starting to think for himself, but now he's firmly back in the system. And the more you watch the Seven and Up's TV series and how it progresses, you realize that it's not so much showing people's lives as they change, but they're using the show to actually coach behavioral models among British society every 7 years, almost like giving a little top-up of this is how you should behave, as these shows get enormous ratings.
Yeah, it's predictive programming too, because you see, the general population have been trained to accept opinions by superiors. And any authoritative figure is a superior, including the BBC. And in other words, official broadcasters, official is the term, from the BBC, speak in a very authoritarian fashion. So much so, by the way, they trained the Soviets and the Chinese. If you listen to Radio China, Beijing, you'd swear listening to the BBC, the way it's presented to them, the public. And they found that the people will follow this as an authority, and you're given your opinions on things. They're very clever in the way that they lead you to the opinion at the end. And of course, people do. They never question. I mean, why should you question something when you never suspect you're being lied to? You never suspect it. You've been trained not to suspect it. And why would they lie to you about something like this? But everything you're seeing is a carefully orchestrated psychological indoctrination with behaviorism and many other neuroscience involved in it too, psycholinguistics, which they call neurolinguistics. It's all professional. And when you see how many people work on one show for 1 hour, with all of the experts I've just mentioned, these different scientists, is staggering, to make sure that you will accept opinion on this topic that they're going to leave you with. You're downloaded with them, and that's used across the world now. It's a perfect system. And again, going back to the Fabian Society with the Hinduism, to break up the old religions and then merge them together into a new cause, a future, always working for a future utopia. it's been perfected, basically. To bring about a utopia, you must create as much misery as possible beforehand, and then offer them the lifeline, you see, of this utopia. And that's perfect. The incorporation of all the Marxist ideology and the top capitalist ideology merged together, that's what it's really all about. So you are a perfect soldier for working, not so much for a good pay and so on, but for very basic essentials and for a good cause for the future and serving the world state. That's always been the goal of this.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. This idea also of Hinduism, you can copper fasten that further into the actual writings of the Fabians. If you look at what, you know, the class system and the caste system, it's the same thing basically.
Same thing.
The idea that the ones to reach the top of the caste system, or within Fabianism or socialism, whatever they have planned, a scientific revolution, will ascend into the utopia of the technocratic future. At the same time, you had H.G. Wells referring to the rest of the people who weren't fit to enter the scientific future as being congenital invalids. This is exactly the same as the Hindu caste system of the untouchables.
That's right. And George Bernard Shaw, again, another co-founder of the Fabians, you've probably seen a stained glass window where you see them bashing on an anvil, like blacksmiths, the world into a new shape. In other words, the proper shape, the whole structure of the world and everything in it is to be hammered into shape. And it's quite fascinating. George Bernard Shaw, I mean, in his book too, Man and Superman, you see, he explains that those who could catch on to technology and understand it and work with it would come through into this new wonderful age. But those who couldn't, who belonged to the old age, simply would have to be eliminated. H.G. Wells went further in his book, A Modern Utopia, where he said, it's set in, supposedly in the future, but he said that how did they achieve this utopia that's there in the book, this fictional book? And as he's traveling through parts of the world, and everybody's so well behaved, there's not many people around because of depopulated. And of depopulated, he says, we thought about just killing them off, like George Bernard Shaw said. George Bernard Shaw actually came out, and I've put up the link on my site, cuttingthroughmatrix.com, where you can actually see him and hear him in an early clip talking about you will have to come to us when we're in power, he said, meaning the socialists, the true socialists, not the working people. And he said, and you'll have to tell us why we should let you live, because you must serve the system. So these guys were way ahead of it. And H.G. Wells said, he says, but the way we settled on eventually was, in the modern utopia, he said, was to gradually sterilize the people of the lower classes that simply hadn't evolved properly and were not needed in a post-industrial system. That's where we are today.
Yeah, and that's where we are today. A lot of people have to get this idea into their head because it's true that the modern world that we live in is fundamentally an expression of a neuroses among Victorian aristocrats, in that they were fearful of an educated society, they were fearful of a literate society. And that's the world we live in. It didn't come about by accident. It was a formulated plan brought together by a bunch of Victorian neurotics terrified of losing their privilege. And that's the world we live in. And what you were saying there about the well-behaved society, that's more and more noticeable. I know quite a lot of people who run businesses from chip shops to restaurants, and they've been employing young people for the last 20, 30 years, and they all tell me the same thing, that the kids today, they're far more well-behaved than, say, they were in the 70s. Mm-hmm. They're very compliant, but they're also useless. Like, you could put them in front of a sink with a tap, and you could say, okay, can you wash those dishes? And they literally would not know how to wash the dishes, or even have the cognitive, self-awareness to even conceptualize, oh, this is the water, this is the Brillo pad, and this is the dish. They have to have absolute and precise instructions.
Well,
so
here's
that's
the key to that.
Yeah.
The key to that goes back to another think tank that belongs to the same group we're talking about, and it's called the Club of Rome. And their book called The First Global Revolution, they have all of that in it. They said that they'd always use the term democracy to fool the masses, basically. But in reality, it says democracy would never work because there are too many conflicting people, parties and groups, subgroups and so on, all fighting each other for power. And because of that, they couldn't get their big agendas through. They're talking on behalf of the elites. And therefore, they'd have to ram things through under different guises, but still give the pretense of democracy. But in that, they said, to eventually the system they would bring in, and this was again corroborated by, again, Wells talked about it, and so did Lord Bertrand Russell, another big member of all of these groups. And Russell even went further along with the Club of Rome, and he said that eventually the people will be unable to make decisions for themselves. They won't have to, because the state will be making all their decisions for them from birth to death. That's what you're talking about right there. They've all been trained to get along with groupthink and to be politically correct. They actually have the inbuilt default positions, as they talk in neuroscience about it, where if you mention a certain topic that's taboo, they will blush and turn all colours and become awfully embarrassed, but they'll go back to default. Even if they start to agree with you, they'll go back to default position. This also ties in with FDR's wife, in the US. She was a great fan of Pavlov. Pavlov was given so much money from the West to experiment in Russia on all this passive population that they couldn't rebel or say no. They were opening up people's skulls and experimenting with their brains where they're still living and all this kind of stuff. It's incredible. And Pavlov came up with the school system of perfect indoctrination as well, using the same techniques of conditioned responses and basically what we call today default positions, setting them in the children's minds. And FDR's wife said on her trip back from the Soviet system, she said, it's so different to see the children on their way to school compared to those in America. She said in America, they're jumping up and down, they're playing and pushing each other and having fun. But in Russia, there's none of that. She says they all go along, but they're so well behaved. She thought that was wonderful. These unsmiling children, all like a military fashion on their way to school. This is what she wanted to bring in, and this is all part of this big system that tied in again with Fabianism and the society that the Royal Institute for International Affairs, with this other branch, by the way, called the Royal Society. They were all involved in the same global movement towards this dream of theirs too. They pretty well achieved it, by the way.
And along with Pavlov, you had Watson in America and his behaviorism, which was even discredited in his own lifetime. But just like so many, like Malthus and so many of these others, it doesn't matter if their quote unquote science, like Pavlov, is discarded. And I find it amazing that Pavlov, so much of his work is cited by the New Age movement as well as some kind of noble quest. And that's remarkable as well. But anyway, Watson, again, appalling things done to children, treating people like robots, assuming that the mind of a dog or the mind of a rat was the same as that as a human being. And even within his own lifetime, his work was completely discredited, but it still becomes a central tenet and structure of these people's agenda.
Oh, absolutely, because he did push all the tenets that he was promoted to push, that all people can be completely trained. Now, it's not all untrue. It's a lot of it is awfully true, unfortunately. You can condition people if you get them early enough at school. The school system's geared to not yourself, everyone knows it's been through the school system. The teachers want the correct answers. In other words, you parrot back what they're telling you. They also want groupthink today. That's a big thing, is groupthink in school. Whereas before you had some individuality involved. Today it's groupthink, where you must all vote on something with a conclusion, or else you're the odd man out. It's so bad in some schools in the US to actually put a flag up outside the classroom if someone has not gone along with the group. And so you're forced by peer pressure to go in, or you're ostracized. You might even end up getting drugged along the road. But this is how bad it is. We're totally in the system that Sidney Webb and his wife and the rest of them dreamed up. We're here.
Yeah, it's totally a cult. It's almost like a cult compound kind of situation, which is also why these people have paid tremendous interest in things like not only political cults like the Chinese Cultural Revolution, but also these flying saucer and other channeling and New Age cults. And that's why, you know, you look at Jonestown, the CIA were all over it. I believe that just about all the successful cults that have a reach, if not every last one of them, the intelligence services at some level is manipulating them. If you read the books on them,
massively,
it's massively, and you see so much of it is tied up with this idea of they use the cults on two levels. One, this idea of the salvation from another planet rather than actually, you know, having it on your own life here. The people in the cults are deluded into thinking that they broke away from the sheeple in society, not really getting the irony that they're actually another kind of sheeple. And thirdly, the intelligence services, they groom and they, you know, you look at some of the most horrific cults, a lot of them such as the ones in France and Switzerland, like the Solar Temple, all over the place the intelligence services can be connected to them. And these are often the ones that ended in the most horrific kind of acts of violence, both to themselves and others. And this is another thing that people have to understand as well, is that much of the salvation that's given to people is also another form of behavioral training, that your idea that your gods or your goddesses are coming from the moon or in the future, or you're channeling them and so on, that this is another deception. Everything in your reality, your whole entire reality is a piece of pathological theatre that's been created for you by powerful psychopaths in positions of power. And even people who think they're fighting or against the psychopaths have bought into these same ideas, like joining cults, like getting involved in political movements that are clearly one more part of it. There's one thing, Alan, I've been wanting to ask you for years because I've been listening to you for a long time. How do you feel about George Orwell? Was he a good guy? Was he a bad guy? Was he one of us, one of them, or was he a mixture of both?
He had been brought up, of course, as a hereditary bureaucrat. Really, his family were bureaucrats, and he had a top position as a young man in Burma and other places as well, looking over massive plantations. Britain in his day, and people don't realize that Britain still ran the opium trade. It was all royal families, which and the members of only royal families that were allowed, that were actually owners of it. And his father ran the Burma Opium Company. This didn't come out. Nobody knew about it. They thought it was done away with in Britain until a politician called Thompson stood up in Parliament in the early 1920s and says, I just found out, but what's the British Opium Company? And when they opened it up, it was a crown corporation that only members of the royal family had shares in. And they're using the British taxpayer and their armies to police these things and make sure the plantations ran well. So Orwell took over from his father to an extent for a short period of time. Then he came back, and he'd been trained to be a revolutionary in the same mode as the Cecil Rhodes group of expanding the British Empire for the greater good, etc., etc. And he went off, as you know, to fight in the Spanish War, Civil War. And he came back and talked in the socialist circles he'd talked to before, and the people turned their backs on him when he said that because they'd all been brainwashed to believe that communism was the same as socialism and for the working man's rights. He says nothing to do with that whatsoever. They didn't want to hear that. He also said in one of his books that he couldn't understand why they kept wanting to push curse words and sexual curse words all through their writings. They wanted the right to do this back then. And he said no. He says, why degrade society? Then he caught on that the whole agenda they were getting paid for was to totally degrade society, to in order to destroy it and bring in a new society. So he did turn against them towards the end, and he did come up with 1984 to explain what that was all about, plus Animal Farm, which is excellent when you actually read the book. Don't bother with the cartoon stuff. Read the book. Because he shows you all the cons they use with the use of terminology and changing terminology gradually, etc., and you don't even notice it's happened. But he went off to an island off Scotland eventually as a recluse. He was paranoid at the time that the group that he used to work for were going to come and kill him, including their communist branches as well, because they ran all sides from the Royal Institute for International Affairs, by the way. And he went down to meet the boat every other week or month when it came in to watch whoever came off it, because he was absolutely certain they were going to try to kill him. And this was kind of verified to an extent, because he had tuberculosis, and when he ended up in hospital, almost a closed shop type hospital. His friends had to rescue him because he was dying in the hospital because they were giving him the streptomycin without the supplementary drug that must go with it. If you don't get the drug with it, you can die very quickly from these intramuscular streptomycin injections and hemorrhaging and so on. So they pulled him out to save his life. So he had turned against them in the end, for sure.
Yeah, that was the conclusion I came up with as well. Especially in regards to just as you said, his life of isolation on Lewis off the coast of Scotland. That was an extreme measure. And again, we see his own life story is a reflection of the system. When he was in Spain, when he was in Catalonia, he was teaching English. One of his students was the guy who went on to kill Trotsky in Mexico. And, Trotsky was living at the time with the artist Frida Kahlo and her boyfriend Diego Rivera. These people were then tied right back to the Rockefellers. So within a very short period of time, you can draw a perfect line between the Rockefeller family through Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, straight through to Orwell and then back to Huxley. It's just too clean and too perfect. And he showed us that in that book.
You remember during World War II that the members of the famous society, the top members, also worked for the MI5. That's verified. So here you have the guys running the communist system. They worked with OSS, which became MI6 eventually. They had Lord Bertrand Russell in there. They had the guy who wrote the 13th Tribe. It slipped my mind right now, but you had a few of them at the top that were members of the top Fabian societies, members all working for MI6, the early MI6 called OSS at the time, and they had top clearance for intelligence, etc., because they used them to fight the German system. So and that ties in with what Carl Quigley said, and he's a historian for the what's called the Royal Institute for International Affairs and the Council on Foreign Relations, same organization. He said that we don't care who we bring in. He says communists, dictators, tyrants, socialists, whatever. He says they all work for us, and that's how it really is. One system runs it all. You see.
And the long-term psychopathic deviousness of it. You have at the same period. Well, right before the Fabians, you had the British Israelite Society, who creates this basic Bible nonsense. But the agenda there always was, from before the Balfour Agreement, was to create a kind of a Western plug, an Ulster, a plantation in the Middle East, in order so they could keep their eyes on the oil and gas and other things there, such as phosphates and so on, that they knew were going to be needed for the emerging economies in the future. And we're never taught how long term these plans are. These people think in centuries, where the rest of us don't even think in decades anymore. Many people today can't even think in weeks.
Well, that's why they called it the Fabian Society too. After Fabius, the general in Rome, who said that rather than hit people head on and have conflict, you simply do it a long way around, subvert it quietly and slowly, and do it in a long-term motion, basically. And that's what all the early founding members of the Fabian Society said too. It might take them 100 years to achieve this, or even longer, but eventually they would achieve it. But as I say, they brought in members like Arthur Koestler was the guy who wrote the 13th Tribe, Darkness at Noon, and so on. These were all novels put out. Well, at least the Darkness at Noon was a novel, and he worked with MI5 too. But Arthur Koestler wrote books to bring you around to the struggle of society, the struggle through all the terrible things that were happening, without saying, yeah, we caused all these terrible things to happen so that you'll come to us when we say we're going to champion you and get you out of the mess. So it's a perfect technique. They cause the problems and then offer you the solutions over and over again. And when you're struggling, you grab the lifeline and you end up in a worse mess. But again, getting back to the form of mind control, they work with the Tavistock Institute. We can never miss this part, because the Tavistock Institute was an early mental hospital. And they had carte blanche by the British government and royalty, the system that really ran the British government, to do whatever kind of experimentation they had to on the human being. as a subject. And they stuck early implants in their heads in the late 40s and 50s and the 60s for remote controlling, although they were hardwired by wire from the brain to little push-button devices, things like that. Aldous Huxley's speech in Berkeley became enthusiastic. It was very hard to get enthusiastic, but he get awfully enthusiastic when he talked about the experiments and how wonderful it was, how they could control the minds of people by literally putting implants in the brain, etc. And it ties in with the Soviet trips they took. I don't know if people realize that it's incredible if you go into documentaries like the Soviet story. You'll hear, as I say, George Bernard Shaw talking about it in Soviet Story. An actual clip from him talking about, "You come to us if you want to live, and tell us why we should let you live." And then it goes off into you'll see people in beds with the skulls all off, all open to the air, non-sterilized the whole bit, because these folk were expendable, bed after bed, and they were probing their brains physically. No gloves on or anything else. But the thing is, in another documentary I've got, which they showed in Britain, by the way, they used dogs' heads. They cut them off at the neck. They kept the blood supply going artificially through it into the neck, and then they'd have the eyes of the dog opening. They'd massage its nose and so on, and see if it would close its eyes and open its eyes. They were doing it with human beings in the Soviet Union. And all these guys went over there, like H.G. Wells and Shaw and all these guys, and came back and said how wonderful it was in the Soviet system. Saw that happening, but they kept their mouths shut. They thought it was great. This is how that they find out the ghost in the machine, as Kessler said, is you and your spirit, what makes you tick, in order to totally control society. And when they did, they said no one could ever rebel again. In fact, George, if you find that Lord Bertrand Russell said it'll eventually become so impossible to rebel against our system, as impossible as sheep rebelling about the price of mutton. He says that's what it will be at the end. That's where we are today, almost. Yeah.
Okay, with that, we'll go to a piece of music and then we'll come back on a different topic, the alien distraction. I had a quick question, which is a simple yes or no, I suppose. Were H.G. Wells and Orson Welles related?
I don't think so. Yeah.
No, you say no, Thomas?
No, I don't think so. No, if they were, it went back a long time.
Yeah.
No, they weren't dead. They weren't directly related. They weren't like cousins or anything like that.
Yeah, okay. And another one, you both mentioned the intelligence organisations all working together. I mean, they're obviously a very important part of this because they can control the start and finish of wars and all the rest of it. Do you think at the moment they're kind of toying with the idea of really creating problems with Russia, or is that just like taking us into a new Cold War, as it were, a fake Cold War?
Well, that's a dodgy one because at the moment Russia is going through a very quick and sudden economic problem. The ruble has devalued tremendously against Western currencies in the last couple of months. So whether they're actually flying these jets into Portuguese airspace and submarines into Swedish waters, it may just be a distraction by Putin for what was going on at home. Do I believe that it's real that Putin is against them? No, I don't believe that at all. Not me anyway. I think he's another one of them.
Well, I tend to agree with that.
Yeah, he is one of them. He is one of them. If you're in his early history and find out his real name and his real family, what they're up to, you get a different story for sure. And don't forget, too, the ex-Soviet system is part of the EU as well. That is still merging into the EU with all of its different steps. It goes through step by step into merging with the EU. So it's really smoke and mirrors for to keep the public on edge. They always keep us on edge. Threats of this and threats of that don't materialize.
Yeah.
We're getting Goldstein's deception. Eurasia, East Asia, Oceania. We're getting that. That's what they're saying.
Okay, welcome back to Reality Bytes on the 24th of November 2014. It's 4 o'clock, 4:05 Eastern in the United States, and 9 o'clock, 9:05 in the UK. I'm going to change topics now and talk about the alien agenda, as it's been termed. The idea that we're all going to be invaded by little men from Mars or from somewhere in a far-off land, something like akin to Star Trek or something. Alan, in your research, where did this idea first come from?
Again, it came from the think tanks, which were involved in, again, like the Fabian Society, and all the other associated think tanks, which are massive today, of how to, if the people are catching on, there's too many things are wrong at any particular time, you must give them something to look at that could even be religious. So they came up with the idea, and also to unify the world. Remember, the goal was always to have world government with these groups, or world domination. And to get the people to go along with these things, they push up along the Marxist line the continuous war is so destructive, which of course it is, etc., etc. And we can't go on like this. We need some outside intervention. If only something outside would come and force us to unite the world to fight it, then we'd all come together under a global structure, which would be necessary to defend us all. And then they came out, of course, with the big movie. It was the day the Earth stood still, where a big flying saucer lands outside the White House, I think it was. And the whole idea is that this alien has to get in touch with members of the United Nations, scientific members, though. They have to all be scientists that tie in again with scientists running the world. And so he goes off in search for the scientists that would eventually put it across to the public. If they wouldn't unite together to stop their destructive behavior, then these aliens would eventually have to destroy you because you were dangerous. And you can go back further. They came out about 1948 with supposedly the first sightings of UFOs over the White House. The guy who saw them all in an aircraft but happened to be a CIA member. So it's the same old thing again, giving people this fake pantomime to an extent. It's something you believe in. Something would take over from standard religions again and get them working towards something. And initially they brought forth something like the aliens are here to help us. That really took off. And then with the whole scientific age of going to the moon and all of that, they pushed all the science fictions, Star Trek, etc. It's interesting that how Star Trek series was put together, because they gave you situations on Earth with different peoples, races, whatever it happened to be, and put it into outer space to show you that the Enterprise, interesting name too, the Enterprise, because it's also God bless us on this Enterprise, you pluribus unum and so on in the States. But Enterprise is to do with markets, and economy, etc. So it goes around the space, trying to unite all the planets into a global, a universal federation, which is simply the United Nations. And they give you the unfair things that happen to minorities on the way, and they make them all free, etc., and bring them into this great trading group in outer space. And the ones who will not join this federation are always the bad guys. They're primitive, barbaric, etc. It was simply a projection of everything in the world that the Fabians and so on have been pushing for such a long time already, put into an outer space setting for a unified world. But it fascinated so many people the way it was done. But you also find top leaders like Lester B. Pearson of Canada, who also was head of the United Nations for a while, but he also became Prime Minister. And I've got his books here, his old books, and one of his workers was also a high-level bureaucrat in Canada who was called Escott Reed. And Escott Reed said in his memoirs, when he worked with Pearson, he says, we drafted up, along with Alger Hiss, who was a communist boy who eventually was found guilty, etc., for treason. But they drafted it up, the whole charter of the United Nations, to try and unify them all, again heading towards world government. And he said in his book, he says, make no mistake, our goal is world government. Well, that's never been given up yet today. That's what the United Nations is there for. The United Nations was set up from the League of Nations, and they were both set up by, again, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, Council on Foreign Relations. Same group. Same guys that wrote up your amalgamation into Europe for Britain, and the guys who drafted up the NAFTA agreement for the amalgamation of the Americas too. They openly said that in Canada. They drafted it up and presented it, and it was signed. These are private organizations, remember. Now, Lester B. Pearson, back in 1957, had a similar idea to the day the Earth stood still, and it says, perhaps there is a hopeful possibility here in the conquest of outer space. Interplanetary activity may well give us planetary peace. Once we discover Martian space, it's always Mars, going right back to H.G. Wells, Martian spaceships hovering above Earth's space, we will all come together. How dare they threaten us like this? We shall shout as one at a really united nations, and so there was to bring the earth together to fight them. This is a guy who was way up there at United Nations and as a prime minister. So this was followed on. Ronald Reagan mentioned it many times during his time in office. As long as an outer threat from outer space would all come together. It's been a great thing to create a mass mind control movement of people who are dedicated followers of ufology, as they call it, and make them all work towards what really is this Marxist system, towards a global system, and where they'd use all our tax money against a tax base from the workers to explore space, etc., which really, again, was a caveat, because the whole idea was to put up all the technology that eventually would use to monitor all of us. That's what the Star Wars program in Reagan's era was all about. It was nothing to do with shooting down satellites. It was to do with what would be used today. Before we even had the computer, they were putting this stuff up in space, getting it all ready, because they knew when they were going to give us the computers to monitor us and the cell phones and everything else. This is how it really works. It's very clever, and we're led like, by the nose, like bulls by the nose, by our masters of the mind. It's perfect. They've never given it up today. Yeah.
Well, people have been seeing lights in the sky forever. It's a well-documented phenomena going back centuries and thousands, millennia going back. And it's only since the late 1940s that people have been coached to see a strange phenomenon of a light in the sky. It's automatically an alien spaceship. Lights in the sky have always been seen long before this, particularly at times of great emotional or psychological or social stress. For instance, they were very highly recorded during the time of the Ottoman Empire, when it looked like the Ottoman Empire was going to overrun Europe. People and communities in Austria and Germany and Switzerland were having these visions of lights in the sky. And at the time, they believed that they were aliens, that were coming to save them from Islam. I believe that these actual experiences are probably either plasma or else they are actually psychedelic experience, some kind of collective psychedelic experience of some kind. But they've copper-fastened the idea again that they're aliens. Now, there's a strong connection I've discovered going back through Germany and all this. In the very first high-quality science fiction films ever made were made in the massive UAF movie studios just outside Berlin in the 1920s. And you had directors like Fritz Lang making films like Metropolis and The Woman in the Moon. These were very well-made science fiction films. Fritz Lang was an interesting character. He said, if you want to get people to believe in science fiction, the whole focus must be on making the actual process of the spaceships and how they operate and fly as believable as possible. So he put tremendous resources for the 1920s into building realistic models of spaceships, realistic portrayals of the lunar landscape, of alien beings, of future worlds. And so much so that this had been part of a kind of continuum in Germany since about the 1870s, when an English guy wrote a book, a guy called Edward Llewellyn-Lytton, I think was his name. He wrote a book called Vril, The Coming of the Power Race. It was basically a science fiction novel about these kind of alien angelic beings that lived inside the earth. And the book was such a sensation when it was translated into Germany that you had these people like Rudolf Steiner and Blavatsky walking around with a copy of it under their arms like it was the Bible, saying that the book was absolutely true. No way could it be fiction. It has to be true. So you had the first widespread belief in this kind of alien salvation race. The genesis and the gestation place took place in Germany at the turn of the century, and then moving up towards the era of National Socialism, where it was totally believed in completely, especially as the films that had been made in Berlin at the time were so good. Now, what it really took off in the West was the Roswell incident. And now, what do we have at Roswell? We have a guy holding pieces of tin foil, and that's basically it. A newspaper and a story about flying saucers. always on a military base. They're always on military bases, these big sightings, and no one ever puts one and one together and then realizes the whole thing's a psyop. But anyway, your man, this guy, Jesse, what's his name? I can't remember his second name, the Air Force guy, pictures of metal, little stories about an alien flying disc crashes. Then the story is deliberately suppressed to make people think that it actually happened or the government is covering up something. And they do not put because it happened in 1947, they do not put the obvious conclusion that this was a psychological operation developed by German and Nazi scientists brought over during Operation Paperclip, who had been running the same psyops towards the end of the defeat of National Socialism by building up this idea that the Führer had a wonder weapon that had been derived from miraculous sources that was going to save the Third Reich in its final moments. The same German minds were brought over to the United States, given jobs in the OSS, as you said, the forerunner of the CIA, and MI5, the modern version, and they were given this brief to use the same kind of ideas of the weapon in the minds of people, because the United States had to create they knew they had this phobia and this anxiety was coming along because the Russians were about to detonate an atomic bomb because of Marxist groups in the US had leaked the secrets over through sort of a Bolshevist sympathy network into the Soviet Union, and they had to condition Americans to believe that we somehow have alien technology, spaceman technology is going to save us. We have the edge, and that continued all during the Cold War, right up into Reagan's Star Wars announcement at the United Nations that we would all band together and to fight a global force from an alien force from outer space with a global army. And you had it in silly films like Independence Day, where you see the Israeli jet fighter guys looking at the Iranian jet fighter guys and giving them the thumbs up, and all this kind of like nonsense, this kind of like one world fighting the aliens. And of course, you had the amazing closing ceremonies of the 1984 Olympics of a spaceship landing in the stadium in Los Angeles and a big plastic alien coming out and talking about how he approves of humanity coming together, as if they're not going to blow us up if we continue to like work together and all this kind. And and yet people to this day it amazes me that people cannot, when it comes to this UFO stuff, this alien stuff, they cannot look at the obvious conclusions that we're just being played for suckers here. That there's so many other explanations for these mysterious phenomena, which I completely agree do exist. But everyone's conditioned with the knee-jerk thing. It's an alien in a spaceship who's come to Earth, and they're either here to destroy us if we don't behave ourselves, or save us if we do.
Yeah, that's a good part of it. And then Russia, and again, too, Germany was. They were the leaders of the scientific age, even in the 1800s through the early 1900s, and they were even making a lot of individuals were making small rockets to go up, into the sky. And they were fascinated by this whole idea. And it tied in with the age of nationalism as well, and how, again, not just weaponry, but advanced science would come from a super-nationalist type system. And then they created the Virile Society. And the Virile Society was again the society that came up with the idea of super weapons that Hitler would eventually use, etc. Out of this world type science that would be involved in, etc. And also came up with the idea that ties in with this Virile Society of the Inner Earth. They put that out there too. The Inner Earth Society. There's actually an Inner Earth Society with the black sun inside the Earth, and people live there, etc. And Bulwer Lytton, who was a lord in Britain, I think, eventually, he wrote a book about it, a fascinating novel that others copied in many ways, to do with these super advanced beings that now lived inside the Earth. And they're still pushing that same stuff today with Mount Shasta in the US. But getting back to the whole CIA operation, it's massively funded, incredibly massively funded across the world. And the professional speakers on them, they make their whole entire career of pushing the UFO agenda. They have late night talk shows that go on forever, years and years, with guys that were always members of the CIA and high clearances and so on that actually host them. You can't get away from the CIA connection with any and all of it, actually. tied in again with Parsons, who also created the precursor of what we know as NASA today. It was American rocket company or something they called it initially. And Parsons was in with Aleister Crowley, again another mind control expert to create all the cults across the world as well. Because all of this is mind control. For those who don't understand it, it really is all to do with mind control, giving you a new belief, a new fascination that'll keep you running in circles your whole life long. You'll lose your reasoning abilities along the way. And you become very, very gullible. And when you're gullible, those with the expertise can then indoctrinate you very easily and have you follow them. It's a perfect system that was worked out long ago, yeah.
Yeah, Parsons was at JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and he was known as the rocket-fueled Antichrist. That was his nickname. He was also involved. He was a close associate of Hubbard. In fact, him and L. Ron Hubbard were so deeply involved in both the occult, mind control, and science that even Aleister Crowley wrote letters complaining that they'd gone too far, that they'd actually gone way beyond what he would actually have attempted in terms of mixing. Basically people have to understand that magic is just a form of science, in a way, or a kind of a theatrical version of science. What I find interesting too is how the idea of the aliens themselves have evolved. If you look at the Vril Society, their belief of the alien was almost like an ethereal being, a spirit. It didn't have form. And then when it got to the United States around the time of the Red Scare movies and all the sci-fi movies of the 50s, the aliens they were very humanoid looking in many ways. There was the one with the day the earth stood still, the guy who comes down by the White House, just him on a robot, but he's portrayed as almost kind of like a Christ-like figure. He comes down like it's very much plays on the Jesus archetype, something that these psychopaths who run the system have always played upon. And then you've had the evolution in recent decades.
Andy, I should just butt in and say he also rose from the dead when he got shot.
That's right, yeah, that's right.
So you very much like, yeah.
Yeah, and then even, you had more humanoid, you still had humanoid aliens around the time of Star Trek. You had Mr. Spock and the Vulcans and many other alien races. And then you have then you started to see the kind of the Babylonian kind of demon creature, the Pazuzu, the zoomorphic kind of reptilian insect demon type version of the alien come in. And then playing, so first we have the alien as the savior Christ, and then they move into the sort of like the demonic archetype, the dark parts of the human psyche that have been cultivated since the time of Babylon and Sumeria through the gargoyles, to the point now where we have two kinds of aliens. There's ones who are kind of like these angelic New Age beings who are like, the Saint Germain, these sort of galactic federation of light, super beautiful humanoids who are on the good side. And on the other side, you have these kind of Babylonian, gargoyle, demonic, reptilian insect archetypes, these kind of Pazuzu zoomorphics transposed behind a rocket ship, who are the bad guys. And I'm amazed by how many intelligent people were woken up who cannot see this Punch and Judy show for what it is. Adults. Yeah,
because it's written so well. Again, you got to get back to the fact you've got lots of neuroscientists and behaviorists working with these writers to and how to put it over to the general population so that it's very, very believable and it's going to be fascinating, you see. And it's going to be logically, the way it's put across, logically fascinating, and that's how they present it to them. It's a great escape for those who are terrified of everything in life and the economy and everything else. It's a great escape to an extent as well. And they start putting their faith in outside intervention coming to help us. So technically they've been disabled. They're outside of activism of any kind whatsoever. And there's no problem to government authorities. Yeah.
And it also allows them to sit back and accept development and technologies which are basically out to destroy us. So they can accept all these horrific military technologies under the assumption that like the Star Wars thing, that is to protect us from aliens, when in reality it's a bunch of weapons pointed at us.
Yes, of course. And as I said too, NASA is constantly putting out nonsense there, because NASA is one of the strongest arms of the military-industrial complex. It's a military organization. And under the guise of space exploration, they've fleeced the taxpayers of billions and billions, maybe into trillions now, to do with weaponry and repairing weaponry in space. That's what the shuttle system is all about, was repairing weaponry in space and preparing us all for this incredible system that's monitoring every single one of us, down to the weapons eventually they'll use on us from space, if need be. Pinpointed accuracy, pencil lasers that can literally put a hole right through you from outer space if you're a nuisance. That's all set up already in space. That's what the true Star Wars program was all about.
Well, NASA...
Can I just come in there? It's interesting. I read something about insurance companies now getting on board with all this stuff, saying that if anything was caused by aliens, your insurance policy was wasn't valid. It's like an act of God thing.
That's right. Well, even the Mormons got their insurance policies out too for the rapture, where they get whisked off and leave their families behind, and insurance is going to pay their families to keep going. So there you go.
Yeah. And you mentioned, Thomas, whether the aliens are here for good or bad, and of course there was a thing in the paper, I don't know if it was a year or 2 years ago, where they said that aliens were watching because of our CO2 emissions, and if we didn't stop it, they'd come and stop it for us.
Yeah, and prior to that, they were watching us because of the Cold War. It's always the same religious archetype. Yeah, it's always the same.
Ties in with the total agenda. That's right, the total agenda. And using environmentalism, control of the weather, upset weather, etc. All of that to save us. It's always to save us all. Is to take all your rights away from you. It's always to save you all. And every facet, this massive army is actually, they called it that, an Earth army. In the early days, and the writer for Star Trek was involved in the creation of that system, where they'd use these massive armies, Earth armies, now called Greenies, and a whole bunch of different organizations, and they'd push it all together with the whole space agenda, etc. So it's all tied together. Whatever they give you, and they give us everything, by the way, unless you think for yourself, you're being suckered into something else for some other agenda.
Yeah,
and the aliens.
Sorry, Tom, just a quick one. I've spoken to people who believe in all this garbage, and you kind of, out of the corner of your eye, you take a set of keys out of your pocket or something, and you throw it in the air, and you go, "Did you see that?" And they go, "What?" And I say, "That was an unidentified flying object." You know, put lights on a frisbee and throw it out the window. That's an unidentified flying object. You know.
Yeah, precisely. Like, I'm not doubting. I know lots of people who are sincere people who told me that they've seen these things, and I believe them. And I do believe there are, as yet unknown, weather or consciousness or psychedelic experiences that probably do generate or are a result of these very strange experiences involving lights, maybe plasma or something like that. And I've no doubt that there probably are intelligent beings out in the far reaches of the universe. It's just mathematically alone it's possible. But that is a completely different thing than ever coming here. And that's the assumption now. Aliens are not out there. They're on this planet. And they've been very, very useful to disrupt any kind of critical analysis of government or globalism by attaching aliens to, serious topics like what we're talking to tonight. And I'll give you an example of that. Prior to the 1980s, academics, educated people, anyone used to sit down and talk about conspiracies. It was not considered a wacky or a screwball kind of thing. People spoke about conspiracies in relation to everything from the JFK thing to, Agent Orange and, DDT. They were always spoken about corporate conspiracies, globalist conspiracies. It was just a topic a topic of conversation, generally indulged, and often you could find it in the magazines of the day, such as Mother Jones and Utney Reader, or Wired. These were not weird things. It was just like historical what if. Along comes this TV series called The X-Files, and you have this guy who's an FBI agent, and he's the nutcase, and you have this other one who's the woman, and she's the voice of sanity, and she's the rationalist, and every single topic in the conspiracy theory world, or, I hate to call it that, but the alternative movement world that myself and Alan talk about, was covered inside at one level, from GMOs to, biowarfare to kind of weird objects being put into injections and given to people, to everything was covered in the X-Files. And then it was coupled to alien spaceships and little green men. So therefore, if you bring up a serious topic today, such as if I want to talk about, I don't know, anything, like we talked about the Fabians, anything, there's an automatic assumption that's put out there that somehow it's connected to UFOs and aliens visiting Earth. And this has been, for instance, I got a message from a guy last week who was saying to me, like, oh, I don't know, I forget what I was talking about. I was talking about this, I think it was the psychopathic traits of Tony Blair, and the guy comes back with, and I bet you believe that Elvis is living on the moon and got there in a spaceship. That's the psyop. That's how it's been programmed, to take anything that's serious that ordinary non-expert people in the scientific system, such as us guys here, can talk about it. Then they deliberately throw in the alien little green men bomb to destroy it and take away any credibility from it. And that has worked so well for them. And like you said, these people are into that stuff. I have no problems with people believing anything. I don't have any problem with people believing in aliens and alien abductions or any of those things, but do not connect them to very important topics in terms of our, incarceration as lab rats on this planet. And that has worked. So the alien thing has worked as well for them as a religion has.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and plus, too, you have so many, again, you do have the CIA involved heavily, all mind-control things, including all the different so-called progressive types of behaviorism techniques that they pushed back in the 50s and 60s, the Rolfing methods, all these different things, where they scream and tear pillows apart. These are all run by the CIA, all of these things that to do with behavior modification and getting absolute idiots to just fall for it all, going to the bottom of swimming pools that were empty and all lie down and pretend they're fish. I mean, things like that. It's amazing what they can do, and then they couple it with the alien agendas and everything else too. It makes you more. Each time you fall for something, you become more gullible for the next one. And I also had a strange occurrence. A woman who was in touch with me for a while by email, a Christian woman in the States, did all the standard Christian stuff, mentioned all the standard Christian stuff, and seemed very orthodox. And then one time she wanted to call me. I answered the phone, and she said that, did you know that Jesus is on Zeta Reticuli with all of his angels? They've been training the army for millennia, and they're going to come back to Earth from this planet, you see, and save us all. I mean, so they infiltrated everything, including, and then what they always do is use existing structures of belief, which is religion, and they mixed it with that too. And that rampaged across a lot of the Christian societies for a long time too, that idea. So nothing has been missed out, but no wonder, because you have thousands of think tanks working in every part, every facet of society. They've missed nothing here.
So just somebody in the chat box was talking about one show you did and mentioned GMOs, and and somebody mentioned maybe they'll do something in a lab and we'll see some little green men somewhere. Do you think that's a possibility, that they'll genetically modify something along the lines of the island of Dr. Moreau, I suppose, and create an alien?
It's more than that. So there's actually scientific journals out there. They've been working on this for a long time, and I have some of them here, in fact, where they talk about the old Plato idea that they would use eventually in the Republic, his book The Republic, that eventually breed folk for specific tasks. Tall folk for picking apples off trees, short folk for mining, things like that. And genetics has been working towards creating new kinds of humans all along. And in their scientific books they put out for university, they have men with gills and so on, all bred for specific tasks of welding oil rigs underwater, things like that. So they're well ahead in all of this, and it ties in again with this it's a sort of misogyny to an extent. It's also using the homosexual agenda, all the different agendas out there. They call it gay now, but to get you and all the in-betweens of transgenders, so nothing is normal. Once they get to a stage where nothing is normal or standard or class is normal, then they can gradually bring in new types of all in-betweens. That's why they're pushing that whole agenda. It's not because they care about gay folk. It's because they can use all of this to disrupt what's considered as normal amongst the general populations. And aliens goes along with it too. Yeah. Yeah,
if you read Zachariah Sitchin to the 12th Planet, I recently read it for the first time lately, a few weeks back, and this guy basically took Babylonian demon worship. This is basically the religion of Babylon, and wrapped this whole imaginary idea of the Anunnaki and the space race around it. And the whole idea was to put this guy. If Zecharia Sitchin wasn't one of them, I cannot believe it's. If you read his book, it's almost like a Masonic tome.
It is. He belonged to the Ashmolean Society. That's right. He was way up there. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Because it basically says at the end of the book, and the whole purpose of that book is to indoctrinate people who read it into believing that human beings are a slave race. They're a slave race who serve a higher race. I mean, this is exactly how the agenda goes on. This is
actually, it's very Calvinistic when you look at it, because you're born into the lower caste, therefore accept it. There's nothing you can do. Your intelligence is set at birth, before birth, in fact, and the upper caste that rule you have the law for rulers. You can't fight them in any way possible. That's how it is. Yeah, absolutely. That's what they tell you in the book. Yeah,
and that's why so many of them come out of the Calvinist religious parts of Switzerland. Van Daniken and people like that. There's so much of that down there as well. And also they've created these cults.
Van Daniken, before you miss him, they revived him again, you know. And Daniken, remember, back in the 70s, was declared a fraud by reporters that went to Mexico, and they found the so-called these space carvings of men on space motorbikes, etc. How you'd do a motorbike in space, I don't know, but they found a guy who was making these so-called stellas for him, and he was getting under $1 per stella that was making. Daniken was put in his book. A total fraud.
Well, Daniken basically has a gigantic cathedral now built to himself in Switzerland. It's essentially like the Vatican of alien history on Earth. And it's incredible.
Switzerland's also very high up there. They've got the headquarters of the Rosicrucian Society. They're very high-level Rosicrucian for very elite people over there, too. It all comes together in Switzerland, yeah.
Switzerland is a particularly sinister nation, but it looks to portray itself to the world as clocks and cuckoo clocks and chocolates, but behind that is some very, very sinister movements and organizations, and the alien stuff through Van Daniken is definitely one of them. There's no doubt about that. The fact that in such an expensive country like Switzerland that he could build basically this Vatican to himself in the scale that it's built means that there's some serious globalist money behind him. You don't get that.
Absolutely.
You don't get that kind of cash from writing books about aliens.
You don't. You don't, and also, I mean, I've talked to some people who've attended the ones in Switzerland at the high level functions, and it's extraordinary how they can manipulate the members that are coming in too, with all their very, very advanced equipment that can project, basically holographic stuff, very big, large holographic stuff, and so on. Giant crosses, for instance, that aren't even there, and things like that. So I've talked to them personally, people who've and some folk even in the Canadian government who've been over and seen this too. So Switzerland's very big in that. It's also, don't forget, one of the biggest Knights Templar countries. You'll see there's logo all over the buildings, all over Bern and all the different big cities in Switzerland. Yeah.
And lots of Nazi gold and technology ended up down there to actually it's a great way for cleaning dirty money and bringing it into these kinds of ideas, such as Van Daniken's Little Empire there. Again, back to the cults, this is another great way of scooping up intelligent minds that should be challenging. That's in Jacques Vallée's book, Messengers of Deception, which I believe is the only book written on the UFO phenomena worth reading. He's basically a guy who started to research the phenomena, basically came to the idea, there is some strange lights in the sky, but ultimately the whole UFO thing is being run by the intelligence services who are creating these cults in order to take intelligent people who should be, they should be the next Malcolm X's or the next kind of people who should be taking our societies to the next level, and then scooping them off into these alien channeling cults. That's what's so remarkable about these cults. They're filled with people with PhDs and master's degrees. If you look at the Heaven's Gate cult, if you look at the Solar Temple cult, again, Switzerland Templars, it's all filled with highly educated people who should be the next generation of shall we say, game changers in society, but instead they're huddled around the device waiting for the leader or the master or the guru to give them the latest messages from the aliens who are going to arrive someday in comets or spaceships. And this has been another wonderful beneficial spin-off for the intelligence services too, with this whole alien nonsense. They've basically stopped any, between that and the celebrity obsession stuff, have stopped any kind of future, shall we say, social or consciousness revolution from taking off, because anyone who has a brain seems to end up diverting it into either one or the other.
Oh yeah, as I say, you must disable people who can think. You disable them and put them into an avenue that leads them nowhere, basically, and they're effectively disabled from taking any action or being social leaders and so on, etc. And then they find themselves being leaders, in fact, and working towards an agenda that they think they understand, but they don't understand it whatsoever where it's supposed to go. They're all being used. Yeah.
In terms of the techniques used, like you mentioned, the aliens or the cults and stuff, I mean, that all comes from, presumably, what we talked about earlier with the Fabians and the think tanks coming up with programs.
The Fabians said, through Annie Besant, as I say, one of the co-founders, it was to set up the feminist movement and also push for the abortion industry early on. And her dad was a lord, the British House of Lords. And she said that they would use the existing institutions in religion, and eventually it's exactly what you'll find the marketers always use. Don't go out and create a society. Use existing institutions where you have masses of followers. And she said, well, we'll use existing religions and eventually win through the churches because they have the biggest amount of followers than anyone else. So we're looking at it as a religious institution. Ufology is a religion. And it actually it permeates all through even the Orthodox religions until you have folk believing all things within churches themselves, all working towards this so-called greater future and better future. It's all the same agenda. It's quite fascinating to see that no one's been unaffected, because the entertainment industry is one of the biggest mind control industries out there. You can take anything, any action whatsoever, any human action or behavior or emotion, and twist it into reverse until you're feeling sorry for people that you perhaps shouldn't feel sorry for, and you have a completely opposing opinion from reality. Things like that. It's all been used against you. They can turn on your tears when they want to. They can make you angry at something when they want to. It's the greatest tool, because your defenses are down when you think you're being entertained. If you're getting a lecture on something, you'll sit back, or you should do, and your critical thinking will say, well, I believe that, but I'm not accepting this part. With a movie, for instance, you swallow the whole lot, including the programming and conditioning that is built inside the movie. So it's a perfect way. You've got whole generations now who are addicted to the movies. They're brainwashed with them, and they're all politically correct. Even all your politically correct things to do with sexuality and behaviorism are put initially through comedies and then filter into the mainstream serious movies, and that's how they put it across. It works very, very simply. And again, back to H.G. Wells, he talked about using this technique way back in the early 1900s.
Yeah, somebody put a quote in the chat box from Mark Twain. It's easier to fool people than to convince them that they're being fooled, and that certainly pertains to the more intelligent people, like you were saying, Thomas, the PhDs and all them. They won't be told that they're wrong, and they won't admit they're wrong. That's for sure.
Here's the key to that, though.
People, yes.
You never forget that those who are intelligent and are going into university, or they think they're intelligent, in the university, your ego is built up above everything else, believe it or not. That's how you end up being a professor. I've had professors visit me, and they admit, and I know this, and I've talked about it, that most professors talk a lot of literally nonsense. It's a lot of verbiage, if you like, lots of words, but pretty well meaningless in the end. But it's very impressive. So it's the same with any science that you're taught in university. It's like medicine. The first thing you're taught is to always dominate your patient. Make sure they believe in you. It's the first thing you must get them to do, is believe in you, so they'll trust you and do what you tell them. That goes across the board now in all universities with all so-called professions that they turn them out to dictate to. So you think you're being taught that you are one of the elite, one of the chosen, and because of that, once you swallow the alien agenda along with it, there's no going back. They'll never have insight into themselves because they're already believing that they are elite and they are intelligent. And once you start to lose that you're just you, and you actually believe the propaganda that you are the intelligent one, you're done for. Always hold on to humility. If you lose it, you've lost yourself. Someone else is using you. Yeah.
Well, by the time you've got yourself your PhD, all you've really done is shown absolute devotion and servitude to authority. You've done everything you were told. Yeah. You've followed every single order. And then the tenured college professor who guided you towards this is then replaced by the cult leader. Mm-hmm. That's why they're so easy to move highly educated people with advanced degrees into flying saucer and alien channeling cults, because they've already been conditioned to seek the absolute approval and devotion to an authority figure. I just want to get back to the cultural thing there again. Another aspect that's been used to sell the alien idea as well has been rock music. You had bands like the Blue Oyster Cult and Hawkwind and all these kind of space rock, prog rock kind of ideas, coupled with the LSD idea of like aliens and spaceships and space travel. And I was reading there recently, not only did you have like people like Carlos Santana saying that he had been given orders from an alien, you also had I was reading recently that David Bowie had spent the early 70s on the roof of his apartment in London holding a television aerial towards Mars, getting signals. You wonder who was sending them signals, don't you?
Oh yeah. But again, David Bowie is a product of the entertainment industry. And I'll tell you another thing too, a lot of the entertainment industry just churns out a lot of rubbish actually about these stars to build up the personality cults. I mean, I've been with bands before that were getting up there, or were up there, in fact, some of them, and big magazines would phone them and ask for interviews, and they couldn't do it. They're either too stoned or whatever, burned out, whatever. And what they would do is say, okay, we'll write a good write-up about you and put some really bad boy stuff in there, and we'll let you see it before we publish it. And they'd make it up, actually. They'd make it all up to boost the personality cult image. And that's what happens with a lot of that stuff. David Bowie first came on the stage in Britain because it was part of the destruction of the culture industry, actually. That's what they would put him out for. They create stars. They create the image. They create the person. In fact, the image and the drawings that they put up with the person, their costumery and so on, their poses, are all drawn up before they pick the person, the actor, if you like. And David Bowie came on the stage with his travelling roadshow, massive, about 6 massive 10-ton trucks, hauling the equipment, lighting the whole bit. And he came on wearing nothing but a jock strap back in the 60s in Britain. Nothing but a jock strap and painted face and all the rest of it. Again, to destroy your whole image of men, manhood, decency and so on. It worked awfully, awfully well. It was to get to the youth and teach them rebellion, as they were teaching them in school at the time, to rebel against their parents who were old-fashioned, don't trust anybody over 30, they said. And that's when they fired a lot of the older teachers and brought in younger ones so the children would identify with them more, with the new radical indoctrinations. Everything has been covered here. Every part of society and culture has been covered completely. Yeah.
Even Bowie's early days, you had like these dissociative personality ideas like Aladdin Sane, the guy with his face painted 2 different colours. You had the cracked actor and the man who sold the world. These were all kinds of they bought into this idea that Bowie was more than just a singer. He was a changer of consciousness. And again, it was too good.
Yes, and he was in space, the spaceman. Yeah.
Space Oddity, yep. Yeah. And there's even a very interesting film of his tour of America in the mid-70s. And they're interviewing his fans outside the concert hall. And they're these people, some of them look stoned, but a lot of them look like they're on psych medications, like some kind of heavy Thorazine or something like that. And this one girl who can barely articulate says that David Bowie is the space commander and I'm his space cadet, which was funny at the time. But when you think back on it now, you realize how beautifully clever these people, their scams are so devious. At times, you almost have to admire them for them.
Oh, absolutely. But don't forget, though, it's nothing to do with talent or skill of the person you see. It's the massive machinery that creates that person in the first place. It's a massive, massive machinery to create the star. They can make anybody a star, and they have, actually, but they can make anybody a star with the machinery. And again, it came out of Hollywood, early Hollywood, where Hollywood came up with the idea of the star image. Before, the actors were 10 a penny. They were not really a reputable type of person. If you were an actor, an actress, you basically sang for your supper to the elite afterwards, after a show. And then they created the star image, and they would create the star before you'd even see them in their first movie. They'd build it up, this new woman or whoever it happened to be, and they're instantly a success because they told the public that they were great, and the public will believe what they're told when the build-up is professionally done. That's what they do with all-star image making. I met guys who had number ones in Britain, and I've been there when doing session work for them for their albums and things. And I've worked on some of their songs, and literally they were picked out of lineups. And I'm talking about drawings now. I've seen the drawings before they'd picked the guy with the right height that would fit this suit that was already made for him. It was made of leather, that stuff like that. How he'd hold the microphone, his gimmicks, his shticks, as they call it. And they were told he'd have 3 hits in a row, and then that he'd fade away. And that's the sort of thing. That's how it's run. There's nothing out there that's real as it's presented to the general public.
Of course, you've got the song Starman by Bowie as well, of course, and the movie The Man Who Fell to Earth, where he was breeding with human women, you know. That's right, yeah.
And that tied in with a whole bunch of sci-fi movies on the same theory, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, and he had all this technology where he could basically afford to buy up the world, and he was buying all these resources and supposedly to take them back to his own planet and all that stuff.
Yeah, he could replicate gold. If you look at Bowie's entire early 70s, or mid-70s and early 70s career, it was nothing other than the alien agenda. Another band was ELO, the Electric Light Orchestra. They came out of a gigantic UFO when they played their gigs. And even the term ELO, Electric Light, that sounds very Masonic, Electric Light Orchestra, Electric Lucifer Orchestra. You know, you really have to look into these people and see who they are, who they're related to, who their parents are, what families and what, public school they went to.
It's also the old God. El is the name of the God, and O is 0 is the eternal circle. It's Masonic too. Yeah.
Okay, we've got 4 minutes left. So do you want to wrap up and basically your final thoughts on either the Fabians, what we've just discussed, or a mixture of both?
Well, we are the end product basically of an agenda. Most of the folk around you are too, because to say the Fabians are one massive think tank with many branches across the world, and they interact with the other think tanks that work on other aspects of human nature, behavior, etc., all working to program the next generation into the future. And here's how perfect it is. If you go back to 1930s, Comintern, the international young communists, of which Pierre Trudeau, that became Prime Minister of Canada, was one of them. They had a meeting with Beria, who was the top honcho there, a monster of a man for slaughtering people. But Beria, in charge of the police for Russia, the NKVD, he talked about the conditioning of children. And he said it used to take us 70 years. At that time, that was about a generation, 70 years. To create the changes through persuasion and through education, to change anything in society even a little bit, because the parents were always contaminated with their old ideas, and they would pass them on to the children. He says, but now with the perfect indoctrination, he says, we can update and alter their changes every 2 to 3 years. And so that the kindergarten children going in 1 year, we're getting programmed from start with a whole curriculum for all the years ahead in education, for all the changes that would be put forth on a timetable plan as they grew up. The ones who came in the year later would be slightly ahead into the further exploitation of this plan, and they would be prepared for it as they grew up. So what you're already programmed for the changes that are going to hit you in your lifetime is from the early age, and you'll think it's called quite natural. You're prepared for it. The program's been put in your head already. That's how perfect it was, and it's way beyond that today, because the culture industry gets massive grants from the governments Every United Nations member has a department of culture in their federal governments that dishes out the grants to writers, movie makers, everything, and novelists, and they must incorporate all the politically correct things in their novels and books and even cartoons. And the children are brainwashed before they learn what the meaning of words actually, because a lot of it's visual as well. So this is a perfect indoctrination of society. And to be honest with you, you'd have to be a hermit living your family way up in some mountain somewhere to escape it all, because with the electronic pervasion of media today, it's everywhere. You can't escape it. Even if you try to shield your children from it, it's pretty well impossible, because their friends have all got the electric gadgets and so on. You can't keep them living separate anymore. It's pretty well done for from that aspect. Again, Bertrand Russell went even further about this. He said, we used to think that we'd have to separate the children from the parents so they'd never know who their parents were. Again, going back to Plato's idea. He says, but now again, with scientific indoctrination, he says the parental input will be impossible. They won't be able to pass on contaminated ideas to their children, and the state will be giving them their new moralities. It's all been done.
Yeah. Thomas?
Well, the agenda goes on, and there is no great awakening, and there is no salvation. It's not going to happen. The 100 monkey does not exist in terms of how these people are controlling us. Just because that's going down doesn't mean that you have to go down with it. And this is where I would say to people, as long as they're not inside your head, you're free. And that's the important thing. It doesn't matter what happens around you. As long as they're not inside your head, you're free. So at all costs, do not let them in there. Do not be a lab rat anymore.
Yeah. You have to reclaim, you got to reclaim your mind. I mean, it's your birthright, it's your mind. Without that, you're nothing. So your mind is all you have. Yeah.
Yeah, personal liberation, and you've got to stop waiting for external salvation and start liberating yourself. And that's I mean, I don't know how would I say it. Stop being Pavlov's dog, and become a cute fox and run wild, and don't let them know about it.
I'd say even better, bite Pavlov.
Bite Pavlov, yeah.
Yeah.
And don't be expecting miracles or people like Russell Brand or some other celebrity or Bono or anyone else to save you, or gods or anything. You're a sovereign human being, and get off the chest.
That's awfully important. You understand there's something called, again, getting back to the creation of stars, it's called the creation of the personality cults. The big boys will always give you leaders that create the whole machinery of personality cult, gets behind them to create the personality cults. And you're always looking for the one. All through the movies, it's the one. You're the one that's going to save the world. No, that's fake. It's a red herring. You got to do it yourself. You got to reclaim your own brain. That's all you have. Get your own minds, and it's up to you where you want to let it go. But you keep your own mind under control as well. Don't be fooled over and over and over again.
And the star thing goes right back to the Dionysian cults of ancient Greece, which Plato would have been familiar with. These ideas of the hermaphrodite, rock star god, who was a sexual being that people fawned over, had no particular talent. He was just Dionysius, and Plato knew this, and they've all known this, and that's still, Dionysius is still going on to this day. And again, don't be fooled. Don't be fooled.
Sorry to interrupt you. We have to kind of round it up there. The next host's ready to come on. Thanks very much for your time, lads. And can you just stay on the line just for a second after the show?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much for listening, folks, and handing over to Patty now.